What would you do if every doctor told you your children would never walk? Yet one stranger stepped in and did something so unbelievable, you questioned everything you thought you knew about miracles. For 3 long years, Elijah Devereux, feared Mafia boss of the Eastern Seaboard, came home to the same unbearable truth. His triplet sons couldn't walk. Jude, Theo, and Elias sat in their wheelchairs like silent shadows, their tiny legs refusing to obey them, their laughter a memory buried with their mother. Doctors tried. Specialists failed. 12 nannies came and fled, and Elijah, whose orders could silence entire families, couldn't command a single step from his boys. Until a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when a woman with no credentials knocked on his door and did something he would never forget. She didn't bring therapy charts. She didn't bring leg braces. She brought a worn Bible, a small tambourine, and a question that stopped the most dangerous man in the city cold. "Mr. Devereux, when was the last time you saw your boys laugh?" Elijah froze. No one, not doctors, not specialists, not a single nanny in 3 years, had ever asked him that. And before he could answer, Helen Wright did something no caregiver had ever done. She knelt on the cold marble floor. She began to hum, a low, soulful gospel hymn that echoed through the silent penthouse. And then, Jude's fingers twitched. Theo tilted his head. Elias, the boy who hadn't reacted to anything in months, smiled. Elijah's blood ran cold. He had commanded armies. He had destroyed rivals. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to witness in the weeks ahead. Because Helen Wright wasn't just a nanny. She was about to make his sons do the impossible. And if you think that's unbelievable, wait until you see what the Mafia king walked in on one golden afternoon, the moment that brought him to his knees and made him weep for the first time since his wife died. Stay with me. You don't want to miss this. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. And trust me, the best part is yet to come. Now, let's get back to it. By day, Elijah Devereux was a king. His empire stretched from the dockyards of Boston to the gambling dens of Atlantic City, a web of money, violence, and loyalty bought in blood. Men twice his age lowered their eyes when he entered a room. Rivals whispered his name like a curse. He had buried enemies in unmarked graves, brokered deals that shaped elections, and built a fortune so vast it could buy governments. In the underworld, Elijah Devereux was not a man. He was a force of nature. But every night, when his armored SUV pulled into the private garage of his Manhattan penthouse, the king became something else entirely. A ghost. The penthouse was a marvel of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline, Italian marble floors polished to a mirror shine, furniture that cost more than most people earned in a decade. But despite its grandeur, the space felt hollow. Cold. The air carried the faint antiseptic tang of medical equipment. Monitors beeped softly from the East Wing. Pill bottles lined the kitchen counter like soldiers awaiting orders. It wasn't a home. It was a hospital ward dressed in silk and glass. And in the center of it all, 3 small boys sat in their wheelchairs, staring at nothing. Jude, Theo, Elias, his triplets, his blood, his punishment. 3 years ago, Elijah had everything. A wife who saw past his darkness, a future that glittered with promise. Marguerite had been his sanctuary, the only person who made him feel like something other than a monster. When she told him she was pregnant with triplets, he wept for the first time since childhood. He swore he would build them a different world, a clean world, a world where his sins would never touch them. But the birth went wrong. Complications, hemorrhaging, 36 hours of hell, and then silence. The kind of silence that swallows everything. Marguerite never held her sons. She bled out on the table while Elijah stood frozen outside the operating room, his hands pressed against the glass, watching the light leave her eyes. The triplets survived. But within weeks, the doctors delivered another blow, a rare neurological condition. Their motor functions would never develop normally. They would never run, never climb, never kick a ball across a sunlit yard. The specialists were unanimous. The prognosis was final. They will never walk. Elijah fought it, of course. He flew in experts from Geneva, Seoul, São Paulo. He funded experimental trials. He threatened doctors who gave him answers he didn't want to hear. But money couldn't buy what he needed. Power couldn't command nerves to fire or muscles to obey. 12 nannies came and went. Some quit after days, overwhelmed by the boy's needs. Others fled after one cold look from Elijah, terrified of the rumors that followed him like smoke. None of them lasted. None of them helped. And slowly, quietly, Elijah stopped fighting. Hope, he decided, was a poison. And he had swallowed enough of it to know. It only made the dying slower. The rain came down in sheets the afternoon Helen Wright arrived. Victor saw her first. He was standing by the penthouse entrance, arms crossed, watching the elevator doors slide open. And what stepped out made him snort in disbelief. A young black woman in a plain navy dress, no jewelry, no designer bag, just an old leather satchel slung over one shoulder, its seams worn soft with age. She wasn't tall or imposing. She didn't carry herself like the polished specialists who usually came begging for Elijah's contracts. She looked, Victor thought, like a Sunday school teacher who had wandered into the wrong building. "You're the new applicant?" he asked, blocking her path. "Helen Wright," she said calmly. "I'm here about the children." Victor had already run her file. Born in North Carolina, no prestigious degrees, no affiliations with elite hospitals or therapy centers. She had spent the last 8 years working in modest clinics, community centers, church programs, underfunded schools. Nothing remarkable, nothing threatening, and nothing, in Victor's professional opinion, worth Elijah's time. He leaned closer, letting his size do the talking. "Listen, sweetheart, the boss doesn't need another resume to throw in the trash. He's seen 12 nannies come through that door. 11 ran. One had to be escorted out after a nervous breakdown. You sure you want to walk into that?" Helen met his gaze without flinching. "I'm sure." Something in her stillness unsettled him. He didn't like it. But he stepped aside anyway, and led her down the long corridor toward Elijah's study. Elijah was standing by the window when she entered, silhouetted against the gray Manhattan skyline. He didn't turn around. He didn't greet her. He simply let the silence stretch, the way he did with rivals and traitors, letting the weight of his presence do its work. Most people crumbled within 30 seconds. Helen Wright sat down in the chair across from his desk, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. A full minute passed. Finally, Elijah turned. His eyes swept over her, the modest dress, the worn bag, the absence of anything impressive. His jaw tightened. "You have no medical credentials," he said flatly. "No references from any institution I recognize. No experience with cases like my son's. Why exactly should I waste my time?" Helen didn't blink. "Because credentials haven't helped them, Mr. Devereux. Neither have institutions." She paused. "May I ask you something?" Elijah's eyes narrowed. No one asked him questions. "When was the last time you saw your boys laugh?" The words hit him like a blade between the ribs. He opened his mouth to respond. Loss of motor control has suppressed emotional, but the clinical deflection died on his tongue. Because the truth was simpler. And worse, he couldn't remember. Victor was shaking his head from the doorway, mouthing, "Don't." Elijah stared at Helen Wright for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly. "1 week," he said. "Trial basis. If I see anything I don't like, you're gone." Helen smiled softly. "That's all I need." Helen arrived at 7 the next morning. The head nurse, a severe woman named Mrs. Calloway, met her at the door with a clipboard thick with schedules. Physical therapy at 8, muscle stimulation at 10, leg braces fitted by noon. A rigid routine designed by specialists, approved by doctors, and followed to the letter for 3 years. Helen glanced at the clipboard. Then she set it gently on the counter and walked past. "Miss Wright," Mrs. Calloway called after her, voice sharp. "The protocols—" "I'll be with the boys," Helen said without turning around. She found them in the east wing. The triplets sat in their wheelchairs by the window, positioned in a perfect row like patients awaiting examination. Monitors beeped. The air smelled of antiseptic and silence. Jude stared at the floor. Theo's hands lay limp in his lap. Elias gazed out at the rain-streaked glass, seeing nothing. Helen didn't reach for the leg braces. She didn't consult the therapy charts. Instead, she lowered herself onto the cold marble floor, crossing her legs like a child at story time, and opened her old leather bag. She pulled out a small tambourine. For a moment, she simply held it. Worn wood, faded ribbons, tiny brass cymbals dulled with age. Then she closed her eyes and began to hum. The melody was low and warm, rising from somewhere deep in her chest. A gospel hymn, old as sorrow, rich as grace. It filled the sterile room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, wrapping around the monitors and the wheelchairs, and the silence until there was nothing left but the sound. Jude's head tilted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a flower turning toward the sun. Theo's fingers twitched. Then, weakly, uncertainly, he began to clap. Just twice, just barely. But his palms met and his lips parted. Elias's eyes moved from the window to Helen's face, and for the first time in months, something flickered behind them. Light. Curiosity. Life. 15 miles away, in a glass office tower overlooking the Hudson, Elijah Devereux sat frozen before a bank of security monitors. He had meant to check in briefly, a habit born of paranoia and control, but the image on the screen held him captive. This strange woman sitting cross-legged on his marble floor, humming church songs to his broken sons, while the $1 million therapy equipment gathered dust in the corner. It was absurd. It was unprofessional. It was everything the specialists had warned against. And yet, his boys were responding. Elijah watched until his coffee went cold. He watched until his next meeting came and went. He watched until the gray afternoon faded into evening, and the humming finally stopped. That night, he came home earlier than usual. He found the triplets in their room, freshly bathed, eyes heavy with sleep. He knelt beside Jude's bed to whisper goodnight. And Jude, quiet, withdrawn Jude, who hadn't spoken unprompted in 4 months, looked up at his father and said, "She sings pretty, Papa." Elijah's throat closed. He couldn't speak. He could only nod, press a kiss to his son's forehead, and flee before the tears came. Sleep would not come. Elijah lay in the center of his vast bed, staring at the ceiling, the sheets cold on the side where Marguerite used to sleep. The penthouse was silent, save for the distant hum of the city below, a city he owned pieces of, a city that feared his name. And yet here he was, undone by 4 words from a 3-year-old boy. "She sings pretty, Papa." He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, but the words wouldn't leave. Neither would Helen's question, circling his mind like a vulture over carrion. "When was the last time you saw your boys laugh?" He didn't know. He genuinely didn't know. And that truth, that single shameful admission, cut deeper than any blade ever had. Elijah Devereux had built his empire on one principle: never hope. Hope was weakness. Hope was the crack in the armor that let the knife slip through. In his world, you didn't wish for outcomes. You engineered them. You didn't pray for mercy. You eliminated the need for it. Every decision, Every alliance, every drop of blood spilled had been calculated with cold precision. Hope had no place in that equation. And yet, he thought of his sons in their wheelchairs, lined up like exhibits in a museum of grief. He thought of the therapy schedules, the braces, the endless parade of specialists who spoke of managing expectations and quality of life adjustments. He thought of himself, coming home each night, kissing their foreheads, retreating to his study, and waiting for the morning so he could escape back into the world where he still had power. When had his home become a tomb? When had his sons become patients instead of children? He sat up slowly, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. The floor was cold beneath his feet. Through the window, Manhattan glittered like a field of scattered diamonds, beautiful and indifferent. He had conquered that city. He had bent it to his will, but he could not make his sons take a single step. And now this woman, this nobody with her worn Bible and her tambourine, had walked into his fortress and done something 12 specialists couldn't. She had made Jude speak. She had made Theo clap. She had put light back into Elias's empty eyes. It could mean nothing. A fluke, a coincidence, a momentary spark that would fade by morning. But what if it wasn't? Elijah's hands clenched against his knees. Hope rose in his chest like bile, and he wanted to crush it, wanted to smother it before it could take root and destroy him the way it had when Marguerite died. He knew what hope did to men like him. It made them soft. It made them vulnerable. It got them killed. But his son had spoken. His son had smiled. He exhaled slowly, a decision crystallizing in the darkness. He would let Helen Wright continue. He would give her room to work, but he would watch. Every moment, every interaction, every breath she took under his roof. Trust was a currency Elijah Devereux did not spend freely. And hope? Hope was a debt he wasn't ready to pay. Within a week, Helen Wright dismantled everything. The therapy schedules went first. Then the leg braces, unbuckled and set aside like relics of a failed religion. The muscle stimulators gathered dust. The clinical charts remained untouched on their hooks. In their place came chaos. Beautiful, noisy, magnificent chaos. The penthouse filled with sounds it had never known. Clapping games echoed off the marble walls. A rainbow of scarves floated through the air as 3 small boys actually reached, with arms that had been limp for years. Helen blew bubbles across the living room, and Jude's eyes tracked them with fierce concentration, his fingers stretching toward the iridescent spheres. Theo grabbed at spinning toys, laughing when they slipped from his grasp. Elias discovered that if he leaned forward in his chair, he could catch the trailing end of a silk ribbon, and he did it again and again, delighted by his own small victory. Helen didn't command them to move. She made them want to. She turned everything into a game. Reaching for a stuffed bear became an adventure. Grasping a tambourine became a triumph. She celebrated every twitch, every grab, every clumsy attempt as though they had just conquered mountains. And slowly, imperceptibly, the boys began to believe her. But not everyone was celebrating. Dr. Morrow arrived on the 8th day, his face tight with professional outrage. He had reviewed the monitoring reports. He had seen the abandoned equipment. He had words, many of them, for the man paying his considerable retainer. That evening, Elijah summoned Helen to his study. He stood behind his desk, arms crossed, the doctor's complaints still ringing in his ears. Dangerous deviation from protocol, reckless disregard for medical guidance, possible regression if proper therapy isn't resumed immediately. Dr. Morrow tells me you've thrown out 3 years of carefully designed treatment plans, Elijah said, his voice low and controlled. He tells me you're putting my sons at risk with your games. Helen stood before him, unbowed. Dr. Morrow has seen your sons twice in the past 6 months. I've seen them every day this week. He's a specialist. He's a man who looks at charts. Helen stepped closer, and Elijah noticed, not for the first time, that she showed no fear of him. None at all. Mr. Devereux, your doctors see 3 diagnoses, 3 case studies, 3 sets of symptoms to be managed. She paused, letting the words land. I see 3 little boys who have forgotten what it feels like to be children. The silence stretched between them. They've spent 3 years being treated like broken machines, Helen continued, her voice soft but unyielding. Poked, measured, strapped into equipment, told what they can't do. No one ever asked what they want to do. No one gave them a reason to try. Elijah's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue. He wanted to defend the specialists, the protocols, the millions he had spent on the best medical minds in the world. But he thought of Jude reaching for bubbles, Theo laughing, Elias catching ribbons with fierce, determined joy. He exhaled slowly. Don't make me regret this. Helen smiled. I won't. The meeting had gone badly. Elijah left the waterfront warehouse with blood on his cuffs and a headache pounding behind his eyes. The Castellano family wanted a larger cut of the harbor operations. He had made it clear, with words first, then with other methods, that renegotiation was not on the table. But the tension lingered, coiling in his chest like a snake waiting to strike. War was coming. He could smell it in the air, taste it in the back of his throat. He told his driver to take him home. He needed silence. He needed control. He needed to sit in his study with a glass of whiskey and remember that he was still the most powerful man on the Eastern Seaboard, even when the walls felt like they were closing in. But when the elevator doors opened to his penthouse, silence was not what greeted him. Laughter. Elijah froze, 1 foot over the threshold. The sound was so foreign, so unexpected, that for a moment he thought he had stepped into the wrong apartment. Laughter, real, unrestrained, childlike laughter, was echoing off the marble walls, filling the space with something it hadn't held in years. He moved toward it without thinking, his footsteps quickening, his heart doing something strange in his chest. The sound pulled him down the corridor, past the kitchen, toward the living room where golden afternoon light was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. And then he saw it. Theo, his middle son, the boy who hadn't stood unassisted since he was 18 months old, was gripping the edge of the cream-colored sofa, his small knuckles white with effort, his legs trembling beneath him. But he was up. He was standing, on his own 2 feet. Jude was clapping wildly from his wheelchair, his face split with a grin Elijah had never seen. Elias was bouncing in his seat, squealing with delight, his arms flapping like he wanted to fly. And Helen? Helen was on her knees beside Theo, tears streaming down her face, laughing and crying at the same time, her hands hovering inches away, ready to catch him if he fell. Elijah couldn't breathe. Theo's head turned, his eyes, Marguerite's eyes, that same deep brown, found his father in the doorway, and the boy smiled, a smile of pure, radiant triumph. "Papa," Theo said, his voice high and clear, "Papa, look, I'm up." The world stopped. Elijah stood frozen, his briefcase slipping from numb fingers, his vision blurring at the edges. 3 years of specialists, 3 years of million-dollar treatments, 3 years of being told impossible, irreversible, permanent. And here was his son, standing, looking at him like he had just hung the moon. Something cracked inside Elijah Devereux. Something he had spent years fortifying with violence and silence and cold, ruthless control. The walls he had built around his heart. To survive Marguerite's death, to endure the diagnoses, to keep functioning when hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, began to crumble. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees before his son. "Yeah, buddy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Yeah, you're up." And for the first time in 3 years, Elijah Devereux wept. Elijah needed proof. Not for himself. He had seen Theo standing with his own eyes. But for the voice in his head that whispered too good to be true. That voice had kept him alive for 20 years. He couldn't silence it now. So he invited Dr. Morrow back. The neurologist arrived on a Thursday morning, Crisp white coat, leather briefcase, an air of academic superiority trailing behind him like expensive cologne. Elijah stood in the corner of the living room, arms crossed, watching as Helen arranged the boys for their usual session. But something was wrong from the start. Jude, who had been babbling happily all week, went quiet the moment Dr. Morrow entered. Theo gripped the arms of his wheelchair, his eyes darting nervously toward the stranger with the clipboard. Elias turned his face to the wall and refused to look at anyone. Helen tried. She pulled out the tambourine, hummed the familiar hymns, scattered bubbles through the air. But the magic that had filled the room for weeks was gone, smothered by the weight of clinical observation. The boys felt it. Children always do. Theo wouldn't stand. He tried once, Helen coaxing him gently toward the sofa's edge, but his legs buckled before he could grip the cushion. He crumpled back into his chair, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. Dr. Morrow made a note. After an hour, he pulled Elijah into the study and delivered his verdict. "What you witnessed was likely involuntary muscular spasms," the doctor said, his tone carefully measured. "Not conscious motor control. It's a common phenomenon. Parents see what they want to see. I'd caution you against what we call false hope syndrome. It leads to devastating disappointment." Elijah said nothing, but the words burrowed into him like shrapnel. That evening, Victor found him in the study, staring at the security monitors. "Boss?" Victor closed the door behind him. "I need to say something, and you're not going to like it." Elijah didn't turn around. "Say it." "This woman, Helen Wright, she came out of nowhere. No connections to anyone we know, no history that raises flags." Victor paused. "That's exactly what a plant would look like. Someone the Castellanos or the Morettis slipped in. Get close to your kids, get close to you, gather intelligence, maybe worse." The words landed like stones in still water. Elijah found Helen in the triplets' room, tucking Elias into bed. He waited until she stepped into the hallway, then blocked her path. "Mr. Devereux?" She read his face instantly. "What's wrong?" His voice was ice. "Dr. Morrow says what I saw was muscle spasms. Involuntary, meaningless." He stepped closer, towering over her. "My head of security thinks you might be working for people who want me dead." Helen didn't flinch. She never flinched. "So I'm asking you directly," Elijah said, each word sharp as a blade. "Are you giving me theatrics, or are you giving me the truth?" The silence between them was thick enough to choke on. Helen held his gaze. "You already know the answer, Mr. Devereux. You're just too afraid to believe it." Helen didn't look away. She didn't apologize. She stood her ground in that dim hallway, this woman with no credentials and no fear, and she did something no one had done in years. She pushed back. "You've spent so long preparing for loss," she said quietly, "that you've forgotten how to fight for a win." Elijah's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about what I've fought for." "I know you've fought for everything except what matters most." Helen stepped closer, her voice rising. "You've conquered enemies. You've built empires. But in this house, with your own children, you've already surrendered. Watch yourself. You're a coward, Mr. Devereux." The words hit like a slap. Elijah's hands curled into fists at his sides. No one spoke to him like that. Men had died for less. But Helen wasn't finished. "Not out there," she said, gesturing toward the window, toward the city he ruled. "Out there you're fearless, but in here, you're terrified. You're so afraid of hoping that you'd rather your son stay broken than risk being disappointed again. That's enough." "Is it?" "Because I've watched you, Mr. Devereux. You come home every night, kiss those boys on the forehead, and retreat to your study like they're already gone. You've built a tomb around them, around yourself, because grief is easier than faith." "I said enough." Elijah's voice cracked like thunder. "You're fired. Pack your things and get out of my house." The words hung in the air, final and irreversible. And then, a sound. Small, shuffling, coming from the doorway behind them. Elijah turned. Elias stood in the hallway, not in his wheelchair, standing. His small hands gripped the back of a wooden chair, knuckles white, legs trembling with effort. He was the youngest of the triplets by 4 minutes, the quietest, the one the doctors said had the worst prognosis, and he was looking directly at his father. "Elias!" Helen breathed. The boy let go of the chair. 1 step. Shaky, uncertain. His arms stretched out for balance. 2 steps. His legs wobbled but held. 3 steps. Toward Elijah. Only toward Elijah. "Papa," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible, "I want to walk to you." The world collapsed. Elijah dropped to his knees so fast his bones cracked against the marble. He caught his son just as Elias's legs gave out, gathering the small body against his chest, holding him so tightly he could feel the boy's heartbeat against his own. "I've got you," Elijah choked out. "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you." Elias's arms wrapped around his father's neck. "Did you see, Papa? Did you see me walk?" Elijah couldn't answer. His throat was closed. His eyes were burning. Tears streamed down his face, the face that made grown men tremble, and he didn't care. He didn't care about anything except the miracle trembling in his arms. Behind him, Helen stood in silence, her own tears falling freely. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't have to. 9 months. 9 months of falls and frustrations, of legs that buckled and spirits that wavered, of nights when progress seemed to vanish and mornings when it returned, fragile as spring frost. Theo fell 17 times learning to walk from the sofa to the window. Jude threw his first tantrum, a real tantrum, kicking and screaming, and Helen laughed through her tears because it meant his legs were strong enough to kick. Elias, the quietest, became the most determined, practicing in secret until he could cross his bedroom without holding anything at all. And Elijah learned to be present. He stopped watching through security cameras. He came home earlier. He sat on the floor with Helen and the boys, clapping along to gospel hymns he didn't know, feeling foolish and not caring. He learned that control was not the same as love, and that being there, truly there, mattered more than any empire he had built. He learned to hope. It was a golden afternoon in September when everything changed. Elijah left his last meeting early, something he never used to do. He stopped at a toy store on Madison Avenue and bought a teddy bear, soft brown fur, a red ribbon around its neck. Silly? Sentimental. The kind of thing the old Elijah would have dismissed. But he wasn't the old Elijah anymore. The elevator doors opened to his penthouse, and the first thing he heard was laughter. Not just any laughter, the wild, breathless, running laughter of children at play. He stepped through the doorway and froze. The living room was drenched in golden light, the setting sun pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows like honey. And there, across the gleaming marble floor, 3 small boys were running. Running toward Helen, who stood with her arms open wide, her yellow dress bright against the amber glow, tears streaming down her face as she laughed. Jude, Theo, Elias. Running. Actually running. Elijah's briefcase slipped from his fingers. The teddy bear tumbled to the floor. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He could only watch as the impossible unfolded before him. And then Theo looked up. His eyes found his father in the doorway. "Papa!" All 3 boys changed direction at once, veering away from Helen, stumbling over each other in their eagerness. They crashed into Elijah like a wave, 6 small arms wrapping around his legs, 3 faces tilted up toward his, bright with joy and triumph and love. "Papa, we're running!" Jude shouted. "Did you see?" Elias demanded. "Did you see us?" Elijah dropped to his knees and gathered all 3 of them against his chest. He held them so tightly he could feel their hearts beating against his own. 3 hearts, 3 miracles, 3 reasons to believe. And he wept. The most feared man on the Eastern Seaboard, brought to his knees on a golden afternoon, undone by the miracle of ordinary steps. He had commanded armies. He had conquered rivals. He had built an empire on blood and fear and iron will. But it took a woman with a hymn and 3 little boys to teach Elijah Devereux the only power that truly mattered: the courage to believe.